frightful parts of our 21st century reality. Tom Ellis, an expert on ISIS, is here today to talk to us about what happens when religion turns violent. Welcome, Dr. Ellis. How are you?
Thank you. I'm doing well. Thanks for having me.
So let's start by, I want to hear about your course and a book you're working on. You're teaching a course on religion and violence.
I am.
And you're well into a book, I believe, on religious terrorism. So
I am indeed.
Maybe tell us a little bit about what you do in this class and in the book as well.
Sure, I'd love to. Thank you. Religious terrorism, of course, is a controversial topic, and in the early 2000s, of course, we had that devastating day, in 2001 especially, and I heard a lot of people talking about how religion had been, maybe appropriately at the time, hijacked by extremists or terrorists, and that religion was really sort of a side thought or a mask for ulterior motives. So I started to think, is there a possibility that religious terrorism actually shares a deep history with religion as such? And so I started looking at religious practices throughout time, and one central ritual practice that we seem to see going back to the early years of religion, at least as far as our texts are concerned, was the practice of sacrifice and sacrificial rituals. Seem to be a cornerstone of religious practices from early times all the way up to the present.
And in the earliest times, that might have been human sacrifice. Is that correct?
Unfortunately, there's a possibility of that. I think it's hard to say definitively one way or the other, but we certainly seem to see pictures and have fragments of written text that suggest that it may have been a human sacrifice. So when I realized that someone like Muhammad Atta, one of the pilots in the planes on September 11, 2001, suggested that his victims would be sacrificial victims, it sort of raised some flags for me. And maybe religious terrorism is engaging in sacrificial practices that are not so distant from what we may consider mainstream religion.
Well, that's a little bit disconcerting, I think. But
it can be.
It's probably easier for us to think that religion has been hijacked by ulterior motives.
True.
Rather than thinking that there's something about religion itself that might lead to violence.
Indeed, indeed. But unfortunately, or fortunately, for good or ill, I guess it's the side of the fence you're on, many scholars of religious violence, one primary one being Mark Juergensmeyer at the University of California at Santa Barbara, he thinks that there may be a deep history and a deep affiliation between sacrificial violence and religious behaviors. I can say that one of the leading theorists of religious violence as well, René Girard, who passed away last year, argues that religious violence may be a good thing. That if we can contain violent acts through ritual behaviors, we may keep communities from venting the violence on themselves. So he actually argues it may be almost salvific for a religious community to engage in a religious sacrifice every so often. Again, in a way to sort of, maybe in a moment of catharsis or venting, but a way of releasing some violent tensions within the community so the community can actually function.
Now, that's an interesting thesis, but I would guess that the sort of terrorism that we think about today on a mass scale,
yes,
that's not being contained, correct? I mean, does that kind of subvert the thesis to some extent?
I wonder, insofar as some of these communities are engaged in sacrificially killing other outgroup members or out of tribe individuals, there is a possibility that this still serves a sort of a function of maintaining harmony within the group. Now, when we eventually talk about ISIS, we can talk about the Shia and the Sunni who are engaged in sectarian violence against each other. Unfortunately or fortunately, again, depending on your side of the fence, this seems to be part of the Muslim apocalyptic idea or vision that there will be intracommunal violence before there's extracommunal violence.
Right. So it's built into the ideology?
It seems to be built in, at least into some of the prophecies. Okay. And I think one, as we were speaking about earlier, I think it's important that we realize that some of the prophecies that the ISIS community embraces today may not be legitimately traced back to the prophet himself. Even though they are saying that these are from the prophet, it does look like some of these prophetic messages post-date the life of the prophet himself.
And when you refer to the prophet, of course, you're referring to Muhammad.
I am referring to Muhammad, who passed away in 632 of the Common Era.
Okay.
Yes.
So I want to get to ISIS, but before we go there, maybe have you comment on a couple of questions quotes. Regina Schwartz has said something like, all monotheistic religions are by their nature violent because they tend to absolutize truth.
Right.
And therefore they're opposed to anyone who would have a position in opposition to that truth.
Right.
What do you think about that notion or that thesis? And that would include then, of course, not only Islam, but Judaism and Christianity as well.
Indeed. I think there is something to be said there. I think any time that we posit a transcendent one and we juxtapose that against an immanent plurality here in the world that we sort of kick around in day to day, I think there is a tendency towards violence. So, you know, if you believed maybe the divinity is manifest here in all groups, you might have a more peaceful sort of human reality. But again, if you hang your hat on a reality that transcends our world, our empirical world, and that this one transcendent entity has one vision and one truth, this seems to sort of conflict with all of the various truth claims that we have in our various human communities here on the earth. And so maybe there is something to be said about a monotheistic tendency towards the violent expressions. I do know, for instance, one Muslim theologian, al-Maturidi, in his apology for Tawheed, which is the Muslim concept of Allah's unity, he makes a claim. He says that there can only be one God because if there were two would entail weakness and compromise. And I think, you know, those can be rather eye-opening theological positions to take up.
Right. Now, the critics of that position, I think, would say, well, secular institutions have a tendency to absolutize as well. So
yes,
maybe think about communism, for example.
Yes.
And that tendency leads to violence as well. Is there something special about having the transcendent God factor in the equation, or that leads to a greater tendency toward violence? Because we certainly see secular governments absolutizing truth and sponsoring violence based on that.
That's right. I think we can basically argue that religious violence and state violence, if it's in the name of an absolutized point of view, can equally be violent. I think what we have to realize, well, maybe we should realize, is that any absolutized truth may be a little bit irrational. Maybe we don't have access to these absolute truths. Does adding a God factor exacerbate the absolutizing truths? Potentially. I think anytime we have what we could call a human-created absolute truth, I think we are invited to question it and interrogate it. But when you invoke a divine entity, this seems to take challenge out of the equation, even though I do know some of these absolutized state violence, Pol Pots, the Stalins, they did not, welcome questioning. But I think, if we can recognize human fallibility, that is at least one step in a healthy direction. But divine infallibility, that's another issue. And so maybe putting God in the equation maybe doesn't help so much.
Is this a critique of religion from people like Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, that providing that God factor raises the ante so much that it becomes an irrational position to take?
I think there is something to be said there. One of our colleagues at, I believe, Iowa State University, Hector Avalos, a professor of religion, and he does a lot of work on the Hebrew Bible and the Christian Bible. But he argues that religion creates what he calls unverifiable scarce resources. So one of his arguments is that human violence will always erupt when there's a tussle over a scarce resource. Oil in the 20th century, water potentially towards the end of this century. But to fight over sacred texts and sacred groups and sacred lands that we really can't empirically verify their sacrality. This is something I think Christopher Hitchens and Richard Dawkins, they find so anathema, that we will fight each other over perceptions instead of actual verifiable resources. And So potentially, is there a cure for human violence? I certainly hope so. I don't have it, but I'm not sure creating new things over which to fight, such as a God-given land.
Right.
I'm not sure this is healthy for the human animal moving forward.
Right. All right, let's switch gears a little
Sure.
bit. We've talked in general about the relation of religion to violence, the possibility that monotheistic religions are more prone to violence. So when we talk about religious terrorism today, though, I
Yes.
think our minds immediately skip to Islam.
Yes.
And perhaps more specifically to concepts like jihad.
Yes.
Groups like Al-Qaeda, and now, of course, ISIS or ISIL.
Right.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Let's just start with ISIS. I know
Yes.
In the past couple of days there was an attack at Ohio State University.
Tragic.
And today that attack has been linked, I think.
It would appear that
perpetrator ISIS was at least
Inspiring.
Inspired the perpetrator. So it's kind of the lone wolf fear, I guess.
Unfortunately.
But first of all, I guess, are groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS, do they represent genuine Islam, or can we even talk about what genuine Islam is? And
right.
How do we distinguish, if we can, between Islam and these recognized terrorist groups like ISIS?
Well, of course, it's very problematic to essentialize a religion because you have all different kinds of groups liking to claim a higher ground, that we're the real Islam or the real Hinduism or the real Christianity. And when we see our fellow religionists, our co-religionists behaving in a way that we consider badly, we certainly would want to distance ourselves from them. I believe, again, fortunately, unfortunately, that Al-Qaeda and now ISIS, they are not completely out of step with Islamic doctrines, Islamic theology, Islamic politics. I think it's important to understand that for a group like Al-Qaeda, they see themselves on the defensive. And we can quote Muslim scripture, Allah does not like the aggressor. And so in a fight to protect their co-religionists who they see under siege by foreign powers, they can legitimately employ Quranic passages from the Hadith, which are the actions and sayings of the Prophet Muhammad, to support their agenda. ISIS started out affiliated with Al-Qaeda, and back when Osama bin Laden was still alive, and Ayman al-Zawahiri is now the leader of the group, they were insistent that this group, this rogue Al-Qaeda group in Iraq, and sort of bleeding over into Syria or Al-Sham, they did not want them to take the tacks that they were taking. They wanted, bin Laden and Zawahiri were really like, we need to win the hearts and minds, this is their kind of jargon, we need to win the hearts and minds of the local population before we declare a caliphate. And the last caliphate, some will point out, was disbanded when the Ottoman Empire fell back in the early 20th century.
Maybe we should define caliphate. Okay.
Right. The caliphate is the idea that there is one leader of the faithful, the caliph, and when the Prophet died in 632, he did not have a son to naturally take over a patrilineal or patriarchal role in the community. So the Sunni community believed that there were four rightly guided caliphs that followed upon the death of the Prophet. Abu Bakr, who was the first, and it's interesting now because the ISIS leader calls himself Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So Abu Bakr was the first caliph. He was followed by Umar. Interestingly, when ISIS first emerged in 2006, Abu Umar al-Baghdadi was the proclaimed caliph. Uthman followed, and then Ali, the Prophet's cousin and son-in-law. This, of course, caused a great rift in the Muslim community, and this is where you have the split between the Sunni and the Shia.
But this is just the rift.
This is the rift.
That both major branches agree that a caliphate is desirable.
Absolutely.
And that would be leadership and government by a religious leader.
That's right. A theocratic regime
governed by
based on the Sharia, the religious law of Islam.
So where they differ is who the caliph is and how you get there.
That's right. Okay. And the idea with the caliphate and why it exploded in 2006 is that there was an apocalyptic fever sort of percolating in the Muslim communities. The Western aggressions in the Middle East, Iraq in particular, and then some of the civil wars that were erupting in the Middle East. Many Muslims saw these moments and instances as fulfilling prophecy, that the Muslim savior, who they call the Mahdi, that he was on the horizon. And ISIS really caught fire with this apocalyptic imaginary, and really at the time, and still to this day, believe that we are living in the end of days, and that the Mahdi, it will soon arrive. So what we can say is that the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, or al-Sham, they are not widely accepted by the Muslim community. Now, they are gaining some allegiance through, say, Al-Shabaab in Somalia. Boko Haram, I believe, has also sort of pledged allegiance to the caliph. But Zawahiri has not. And as far as Al-Qaeda is concerned, they're very much concerned that ISIS is pursuing tactics that will not win the hearts and minds of the population. ISIS has gone in for a more Machiavellian approach, which is it's better to be feared than loved. So ISIS is providing state-building services. They're providing public services like water and sanitation, but unfortunately their implementation of the hudud, or the punishments that you find in Sharia, are quite severe and publicly advertised. So
and they've made use of social media to...
Oh my goodness.
And that's been a new kind of phenomenon here.
That's exactly right. While the black flag of ISIS likes to have some of the scribbling on top look like it predates the computer age, they are extremely savvy when it comes to multimedia, social media. And Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi is no slouch either. He has, this may shock some people, he has a Ph.D. He has a Ph.D. in Quranic recitation. This man is an intellectual.
So let's back up a little bit. If the ultimate goal of ISIS is a caliphate.
Yes.
Are we talking a local caliphate? Are we talking a Muslim world caliphate? Or are we talking a global caliphate? What's the end game here? Global.
The caliphate as such has to expand. It has to control territory. It has to have centralized power, which is something that Al-Qaeda never did, and that's what made Al-Qaeda so dangerous. It was so decentralized, even though bin Laden at the time was pulling the strings, and Zawahiri seems to be doing so today. But the caliphate, in theory, has to expand. And it is a notion of someday the caliphate will be global, and we will all be beholden to Sharia, to the theocratic Muslim law. So if we can contain the expansion of the caliphate, this in itself is a move towards delegitimizing their claim to power.
Right.
So it might not necessarily be we have to get them out, but seriously, simply containing them, showing that they cannot keep expanding. They completely disregard nation-state borders. So the Peace Treaty of Westphalia, 1648, I believe it was, established autonomous sovereign nation-state borders. ISIS does not recognize this. They do not see nation-state borders as being any political claim.
Is that a contemporary political strategy employed by governments in the Middle East, or even by our own United States government, that is containment rather than ultimate defeat of this?
Well, I think all concerned would ultimately want to see defeat. And I think that will eventually happen. I think...
so you don't see an expansion into the global caliphate?
I do not see an expansion. I don't... Iran won't have it. I don't believe it at present, because Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi couldn't be more anti-Shia. So Tehran is not going to be interested in ISIS spilling over into its borders.
Right.
So I think, it's going to be a long process. If anyone out there is interested in this ending tonight, it won't happen. But I think the policy we have in place now, we'll have to see what President-elect Trump does when he gets into office and how he might alter his policy. But a patient policy of supporting with intelligence, maybe not big weaponry, but supporting some of the local tribal leaders in the area. This may be a slow, patient way of containing ISIS, and again, ultimately leading to a delegitimacy.
You mentioned the apocalyptic factor here with ISIS. Is that one of the things that sets ISIS apart from other groups, either mainstream Islam or Al-Qaeda? And that seems that ups the ante too. When if you see yourself engaged in a final battle between good and evil.
Heady stuff.
It is.
Heady stuff. Bin Laden and Zawahiri did not like the apocalyptic fever that someone like Zarqawi, when he first started getting engaged back in 2004, Zarqawi was very much a fire with apocalypticism. Bin Laden and Zawahiri, they sort of felt that was almost a little too superstitious. They didn't see that as appealing to the masses. But indeed, it would appear that a lot of the strangers, and this is code in ISIS for fighters who come from afar to support the state, there is no doubt that talking apocalyptic talk, giving some of these young men who tend to be the ones who are taking up the fight the most, 18 to 22-year-olds, who may not have professional and marital prospects on the near future, who may feel disenfranchised. You give them a sense that they're going to become part of the Mahdi's army. This can be quite seductive. And I think this is, again, part of what is appealing to what appeals to many when it comes to the Islamic State. That they are talking a talk of, we're in the end of the days, this is happening now. Of course, apocalyptic fever is not unique to ISIS.
No, I mean, obviously, right.
I think back in the first century of the Common Era, I think we could say St. Paul and maybe even Jesus had notions of an imminent apocalypse.
Right.
But unfortunately, ISIS is playing that card, and they're playing it well, and violently so.
You brought a book today.
I did.
A lot of our viewers are. It's a very complex subject, of course.
It is a complex subject.
And a lot of our viewers might be interested in learning more about ISIS and religious terrorism.
Absolutely.
Until your book comes out.
That's right. You'll have to wait on the edges of your seat.
Well, tell us a little bit about this book, which I think you've used successfully in your class.
I did. I just finished up this. This is by William McCants. He's at the Brookings Institute, and he does adjunct work at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland. And he's a specialist in Islamic terrorism, jihadism, state building, Arabic, and so he's uniquely positioned to not only vet some of the prophetic claims that are being made by this group, as far as is it really traceable back to the Quran or the Hadith, but he also has done a lot of work in religious violence. And so this is a 2015 book, St. Martin's Press, The ISIS Apocalypse, and for any of our audience who are interested in it, it's an easy read. This is for a popular audience.
Accessible for a general
Very
audience.
Accessible. If my Appalachian State students, undergraduate students, can read it and get through it, I think our audience can as well. So I thought I'd share that with.
It's a great recommendation.
Yeah,
a lot of times we want to learn about these movements, but there's so much out there, and it's hard to know what's legit.
It's hard to distill some of it. That's exactly right.
So a final word about religion and violence.
Yes.
We start off by saying that we typically think about peace when we think about religion.
Yes.
Religion, we'd like to think, is a force for good in our society, a force toward peace and human fulfillment.
That's right.
Is there hope for religion in the future, or has religion taken a dangerous turn? Or are we just in the midst of it and feel the weight of history a little more being in it?
Maybe the latter. I'm not sure what we're seeing today with religious violence, again, is anything historically new. What could be new is our access to greater weaponry. I think I would not want to be a doomsdayer for religion. I think religion provides many people with great sources of inspiration and hope and peace. I think where religion could lead us astray is if it leads us into an intolerance for other voices, for dissenting voices. Right. If we can be tolerant of those who disagree with the things that we think are most important and still live together, I think that's the way forward. I think a little bit of the Enlightenment values of, humanism and tolerance can live side by side with some of these, even the exclusive monotheistic claims of some of our Abrahamic traditions. Yeah. I don't see religion going anywhere anytime soon, and I'm not one to sort of pronounce that it ought to. Yeah. But we certainly should be willing to criticize and ask very serious questions of religion when we sense that it may be a fundamental motivation to violence against others.
Well, maybe it's on that point of challenge and hope that we should end this. All right.
I have it.
Well, thank you very much. And we look forward to your book, by the way.
Thank you.
Me too. To see that. Thank you, Dr. Ellis, for coming on the show today.
My pleasure.
And thank you for being with us. Until next time, I'm Ozzie Ostwalt.